Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Pellowe Talk. This is the good news that you're going to get, which you won't get on the mainstream media or elsewhere. We're doing this just exactly because it seems like there's nothing but bad news at the moment. It seems like there's nothing but a determination from the media to make us stressed and anxious and upset and worried. And even this morning, there was some reports of good news in the media about numbers in Australia of infection rates not being as high as previous dates, recent days, and they were in a hurry to tell us not to be too optimistic, not to be too excited, not to be too happy, because we can't take those numbers too seriously. So now, look, there's some perspective that they were trying to offer, but there's all this negativity out there. So we're doing good news. Now, joining me today, I have a good friend ever since the first Church and State Summit, and I can't remember how we met before that, but welcome to Pellowe Talk, Brendan Malone.
G'day, Dave. Hey, I can clarify that, mate. Like a good wife can tell you when you first met. We met at a conference in Brisbane. I came to speak at a Right to Life conference, I think it was, or a pro-life conference.
Yeah. Yep.
And I flew all the way over from New Zealand, and it was I left New Zealand in the end of June, and it was 3 degrees and almost snowing, and I arrived in Brisbane and it was 26 degrees, warm. Everyone was complaining over there it was too cold.
Yeah, it sounds like when I was in New Zealand. My dad's from the very, very southern tip, Dunedin, Mosgiel, and I think it might have been, it was January, so middle of summer, and we went to a town where he used to holiday as a child, and he had a batch by the sea. For Aussies who don't know what that is, it basically means a hut, shack. And I think it was 4 walls, a floor, a roof, and the beach. But the town was, I'm sure there were tumbleweeds blowing down, and there was eerie music playing because there was nobody around. Everybody was at the beach. It was crowded. And so we went into the water, and I'm sure there were ice cubes floating in it. It was ridiculous. I don't know how do you get in water like that?
That is the deep south. I used to be a technical rep on the road for a company, and I had the whole of the South Island was my territory. And I remember going to the very bottom of the South Island, Invercargill, and you'd stand on the wharf at a place called Bluff. It was literally the bottom of the South Island. And on the right day, you'd get that Arctic wind. It would blow, and you'd feel the Arctic wind, mate. A lot of Scottish people live down there. It's interesting when you look at a map of New Zealand and you track the Māori place names. And up north, really warm, lots of Māori place names. Keep going further south, and they all start getting less and less. And when you get to that Dunedin, Invercargill end, all of a sudden, that's where the Scottish people went.
Yeah, that would have been right at home there. So funny, those Scots. Hey, for those of you who don't know Brendan Malone, you've actually changed jobs recently. I think you used to be fairly involved with some of the key family organisations in New Zealand, and God's called you to start your own ministry under your own name and direction at the moment. Tell us a little bit about that move in just a minute or two.
Yeah, so I used to be probably when we met, I was working for Focus on the Family in New Zealand, probably an organisation known to a lot of people. Funnily enough, even despite the move, I still do a lot of work with those same organisations. So very little on the ground in that way has changed. I still do work with and consult with Focus on the Family, but quite a bit. But I'm now the director of the LifeNet Charitable Trust, and my focus really is around the whole area of bioethics formation and education for we run pro-life training weeks in New Zealand and in Australia, also training for ministers and church leaders in these areas, and I do a lot of speaking at conferences and schools around New Zealand and of course now Australia as well. The big reason for moving into this new arena was it's really like a lot of things. I think it was about funding. So I moved set up my own charity to try and sort of streamline funding requirements and ensure that I could keep doing the work that I believe I was called to do. So that's where I'm at and why that happened.
Awesome. And we have our first g'day from Fiji.
Look at that.
Somebody called Shalom.
It's not cold in Fiji.
No, it's not. And do Fijians say g'day, or is this an Aussie or a Kiwi Shalom, let us know.
Isn't it? It's Bulavanaka, isn't it, in Fiji?
That's right.
I think I could be wrong. I could be wrong. So
no, I think you're pretty well. I think you're pretty well on the money there. Look, let's talk about some of your specialties, bioethics. Now, you posted an article recently. Why don't you go ahead and share that screen? Not sure if you still can.
Yeah, I will. Let me get the article up, and here I go. Look at this, the magic of technology, and I'm about to start sharing my screen. And there we go.
There we go.
Alrighty, can everyone see that now?
Yep, we can see that.
Yeah, so this is a great recent new article, March 26th. So you can see it's very, very recent, from an organization called the Culture of Life Foundation. Complex moral issues made simple. And what's great, I think, important about this, and I posted on Facebook yesterday, and I encourage everyone to read it, is because the reality is, for a lot of people, this could well be a situation they find themselves in. There's no doubt, where they're having to make ethical decisions about not necessarily for themselves, but possibly for a family member. And so it's important to understand the whole question of triage, which is where you're treating people under extreme emergency situations, and you have a limited number of resources and personnel. What do you do?
Don't forget to turn your phone off, Brendan. Sorry,
I was like, what's that, mate? Are you bandsawing up a cat in there or something?
That's my ringtone is still A Christmas Carol.
Oh, there you go. Now, the what's really good about this article, as I said, is it explains exactly in a situation of triage what the ethical principles, if you are someone who is a believer in what I would call dignitarian ethics, that's the Christian perspective. There's humanitarian, dignitarian, pro-life ethics around medicine and healthcare, and it's a very well-written article. It makes a series of points. I think it's 14 different points, and I think the key one really that I want people to get their head around is this point about it's number 5 here. And you can see my mouse, I'm highlighting it here. Neither, it must be insisted, are age or disability reasons to prioritize or restrict care.
Now, let me just give context to this. This is particularly relevant because in recent news, as recent as weeks ago, we saw Italy making the decision that due to the overwhelming burden on their healthcare system and the very limited number of healthcare resources, specifically ventilators, that they weren't going to offer that resource to anybody who fitted into the category of geriatric, essentially. And so the whole world's going, wow, can you do that? Can you just decide to not prioritize healthcare for people because of their age?
And I would argue, and in line with what this article is saying, that no, that's not the right principle. As you'll see here, it does say in the next point, it talks about how age and disability, when they're accompanied by other factors, would obviously play into this. And this is where there's a sort of what you might call the complexity of ethics applied at a practical level under extreme circumstances. And so it's not just simply straight black and white, but the general principle is you can't. I understand they've done this in Spain as well in recent days. Said no one over 65 is getting a ventilator in some places. Now, quite frankly, that is not an acceptable application of ethics. What they should be doing is saying, okay, we go case by case. We've got a case in front of us, and we look at the factors. Let's say they've got cancer. They're 70. They've got cancer. They may have other comorbidities. And their likelihood of surviving, even if we give them a ventilator later, is low. So that would be the sort of the mix of factors, and you'd make the decision that way. But to simply say, well, I'm sorry, you're over 65, that's it, you're cut off, or you've got a disability, you're cut off, or even alarmingly, I've seen even in some places, there's in some documents, not medicine ethics documents, but sort of policy documents around this, they're suggesting even things like intellectual disability.
Wow.
Now, this is, thankfully, that's not medical ethics. It's not doctors who are saying that. They're sort of policymakers. But we've got to be very, very careful about this at a time like this, that we don't look back and realize that we embraced a utilitarian ethic where we said the end justified the means, and we destroyed our humanity in the process of supposedly trying to save humanity.
Has utilitarian questions, the long life that somebody's lived, their age or their mental capacity, has that ever been a factor in classical medical triage training?
There's no doubt that there's what you might call a utility component where you would say, is it futile to do a certain thing? And what you're doing there is you are evaluating a sense of utility. What's our sense of success? What is the outcome going to be? But in the sense of should we apply utilitarianism, which was really this idea, how do we maximize the greatest good in the world, or how do we maximize the greatest amount of pleasure over pain in the world? And in this case, you're talking about how do we save the most people?
Yeah,
That's a very different concept. And the general norm is, even in triage, the understanding is that you don't simply apply a blanket utilitarian ethic in that way, where you would say, well, certain categories of people, just because they're in that category. What you would do is you would look at, it's really the health factors that need to be examined here when you think about the utility of a treatment. So, for example, and this document rightly points it out as well, you might have someone who's older, you give the ventilator to that person, but their condition changes. And 2 days later, it's very apparent that you've got a shortage of ventilators, but that person who's got it is now actually, their circumstances changed and they're not likely to survive. So you are then in a position where it would be ethically acceptable to remove that ventilator and give it to someone who's more likely to survive. But you'll see that's got nothing to do with age or disability. And it's really important that doesn't become the determining factor.
Yeah, so he's just saying there in point 8, as treatment commences, the improvement or decline of a patient is an acceptable and reasonable standard by which to reassign scarce resources. So we're not saying that making a decision about who's going to get treated is wrong, just that there are certain criteria that we shouldn't be going with, like the number on their birth certificate.
That is exactly right. And that's because what you're doing there is you've created a situation where you have acted in a very, I'd say, gravely unjust and prejudicial way towards an entire group of people. You're effectively saying those people in that category, regardless of their actual health outcomes or their current physiology and the status of that, we can treat them as if they are disposable in order to save the young and the fit. And that we all know that is not a good ideology at all.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for tuning in. You're watching Pellowe Talk. I'm Dave Pellowe, and my guest is Brendan Malone, New Zealand celebrity ethical commentator. Maybe not so celebrity, but he's celebrated here in Australia at least. And he's drinking from a mason jar instead of his Pellowe Talk mug, which is proudly bearing his stationery because the pen is mightier than the sword or something like that. Do us a favor and share this stream. We're bringing you the good news because there's way too much of the alternative out there going on. So the good news regarding ethics is that we're in a society which actually asks these questions. We're in a society that understands, look, I'm going to say largely due to the advent of Christianity right back in pagan Rome, that every human life is precious and worth defending at every stage. And even in death, the ancient Christians in ancient Rome practiced respect for the deceased's body, and even for people that weren't of any family relationship to them. And they buried them with honor and dignity, believing what's in the Word of God, that we are made in the image of God. It's that Latin phrase, imago Dei. And that has undergirded Western medicine and jurisprudence for a long time. The concept of justice is that everybody is equal and the law should treat them without partiality for any identifying factors such as age or race or gender.
Can I speak to that too, Dave? That people underestimate just how profoundly important that shift was in the ancient world when Christianity arrived in the world, obviously with the advent of Christ, and just how pivotal that was. And we can point to it. We can see this in St. Paul when he writes to the church at Galatia, and he says very clearly, and this is a very new concept in the ancient world, there is now therefore no Jew or Gentile, no woman or man, no free or slave. And he says this also to the Colossian church as well. And he mentions barbarians and Scythians. And he says, all are one because of Jesus. Now, what he's saying there is everyone now has moral equality regardless of their gender, regardless of their race, regardless of their social status. That concept is foreign to the ancient world. And it's a concept that turns the world on its head. And it's exactly why, as you say, we don't differentiate. And I think if there's a positive in a moment like this that's I think is worth highlighting, is that we actually have the opportunity now in a situation to confront and ask, well, what are our ethics? And the Christian church has a profound opportunity to stand up and say, hey, here's how authentic, humane community is supposed to look at a time like this.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, you also, let me see, we'll share my screen now. You also shared this yesterday, that New Zealand, look, you might even just want to give us a 60-second overview, because most of the viewers, if they're watching from my channels, may not be aware of the level of lockdown going on in New Zealand, and then overview this this perspective here. Let's have a conversation about the proportionality of the various responses in our nations.
So what we've got in New Zealand, last Wednesday at 11:59 p.m, we went into what is called lockdown in New Zealand. And what that means is that you are not allowed to leave your home except in a situation where you need to seek out medical care. So that could be a pharmacy or going to see a doctor, or you need to go and get essentials from the supermarket. Now, in the last 24 hours, that is the last 12 hours actually, they've now included some online retailers who are able to retail things like heaters and whitewear and essentials. So but it has to be online ordering. And the only people that they've exempted from that are people who are classed as essential workers. So a supermarket worker is now an essential worker. IT technicians are essential workers, police, firemen, medical staff, and so they would obviously still be traveling to their work. But basically what's happened is, oh, look at that. This is an internet meme come to life. My daughter has just walked into the room. Say hi. So what has happened effectively is that the streets are now quiet. You are allowed to go for a walk around your neighborhood if you want to have exercise. You're not allowed to drive, though, to a track. You're not allowed to go hunting, which for me was a bit gutting. No. Even though you can maintain isolation in the bush, you're not allowed to do that. So we're locked down here.
We can't have the deer catching the flu.
No way. We can solve that problem.
Yeah, no, that's not going to be good. So exactly what's gone on with this headline, that whether they should be, have they closed too many businesses? Are they thinking they might have gone a bit too far?
Well, here's my kind of frustration, I think, and this is what I was trying to express in the post. We're now 5 days into this nationwide lockdown, and one of the most essential components of a lockdown is food supply. You can't just lock people in their homes with no food. You can see how that gets out of control pretty quickly. Yep. So it's really essential you get that right. And what they initially did was they said supermarkets only, no fruit and veg stores, no butchers. And so it didn't take long for the supermarkets to realize, we're now operating under a monopoly. Yeah. And so straight away, the prices went up, and dramatically so. Like there was one store that had a head of cauliflower for $13 or $12 for a head of cauliflower. There was a chicken, one of those cooked chickens, $30. Yep. Now, they claimed, it was a pricing mistake, just a tag mistake. But there's enough of these to say, and I went into a supermarket on the Wednesday, which was the lockdown didn't start till midnight that night, and there were no specials. All the specials had been turned off. Wow. Now, so it's even, there's no reason to do that. That doesn't discourage bulk buying because they placed limits. You only have 2 of certain things. So even if it's on special, that doesn't change people's ability to buy more of them, for example. So now the government has clearly identified that was an issue. And so in the last 12 hours, they've now opened up fruit and veg stores, certain produce stores. The decision-making was kind of odd because they allowed dairies. I think you call them milk bars in Australia, do you? Like the local corner shop.
Well, that's what we call it.
Yeah, you go buy an ice cream or an emergency
or a dairy.
Yeah, there you go, dairy. So they allow dairies to be open.
A dairy is where you get cow out of a milk, milk out of a cow.
So some things don't translate. So here's the thing though for me. 2 weeks ago, we knew that this was on the global scene. This was a crisis. We knew it was, and we knew it was coming. Yep. And our government just carried on with business as usual. And my argument was that they should have 2 weeks ago suspended Parliament. They didn't. Just last week was it, or the week before? They'd spent almost 2 full days the week before on passing a very extreme abortion bill in New Zealand. And so you see how if we'd put that time aside 2 weeks ago and brought all the MPs and the Grand Coalition together, we could have been focused on that issue as one of the primary concerns. How do we ensure and make a good policy around that? So there's things to praise about what they've done, but there's definitely, that's my post was about saying, I think 5 days into it, this probably should have been thought about before we got to this point.
Yeah, definitely. I'm actually not opposed to what would be, I think, emotionally called price gouging. Yeah. However, it has to exist not with a protection racket. It has to exist in a free market. Price gouging is clearly the government's culpable in that situation arising. However, in a free market, one person price gouging creates space for somebody else to offer a competitive price.
That's right.
And if they need to have that exorbitant profit as an incentive to keep up supply where supplies are challenged, then that also is an indirect solution to a problem that the government couldn't provide in itself. That's really complicated, and
I agree with you.
Opportunistic sharks. I am offended by them, but I think what I want to add to a conversation about that is that there is almost never any consideration for the positives of that environment where a supplier can charge an unusually high price for a product or service that's perhaps in demand during a crisis.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing, isn't it? And this is one of the age-old debates, really. And I think we're starting to see more of this around what I would call the conservative political movement. And there's that tension between what I would call, I'm more of a Burkean conservative in the mold of Edmund Burke.
Right.
And as opposed to the more libertarian, the libertarian sort of strand that it has sort of taken hold, if you like. Yep. And there is a tension when it comes to these economic questions with libertarians and conservatives. Hold on, mate. Yeah. Can you go and see the others and see how they're getting on? This is classic. This is history repeating. Just about every live stream I've done.
We're not the BBC. We're pretty relaxed.
That's right. It's pretty. But so there's that tension between the sort of libertarian model, which says, just no restraint at all on a market, and the Burkean conservative, which would say you must not unfairly inhibit a market, but you must also be careful that the lack of ethics doesn't result in unjust behaviours. So there's a tension there, I think, that it's worth considering, especially at times like this.
Yeah, look, there's certainly a place for government regulation, and I would be not in the camp of eliminating it, but I'm certainly in the camp of minimising it.
Well, especially in a situation like this, you've got to be very careful where everyone's trapped, they're locked down, you close everything but these certain stores. This is a very, very tenuous sort of situation you're creating in a market. It's really, you've got to be so careful. As we know, you just tweak even certain levers a little bit, you can create massive outcomes. So let's talk
about the human cost of an economy shutting down. Our trade unionist in chief in Australia, Sally McManus, recently tweeted that she thought there was going to be an interesting experiment with not a small amount of cynicism, saying that Jacinda Ardern's priority on complete wage subsidisation and complete shutdown of the entire economy, in stark relief to President Trump's priority on getting the economy going or keeping it going as much as possible. Is there, I guess, what are your thoughts? The human cost on this? Is the average, I guess, person left of centre, without wanting to use any pejorative labels, are they really misrepresenting a concern for the economy as pure greed?
I think that's a fair question. And I think here's where I think the political labels don't help, and where we need to get down to ethics, to actual brass tacks. What's the ethical thing to do in a situation? Because there is a tension. First of all, there's a complete mischaracterization, as if this is just Donald Trump playing gung-ho, for example. And he's like, I don't care about people. I only care about making Benjamins. That's not what he's saying at all. I've bothered to take the time to listen to what he's saying, and he's rightly identifying, if you crash the economy and cause a depression, you can forget about healthcare altogether. So there's a finely tuned balance here. Secondly, it's not just Donald Trump. It's the Netherlands, Sweden. They are not right-wing countries, and they are both maintaining social distancing with an open economy because they've adopted the same policy. They need to be cautious to ensure they don't cause a depression. So that's it. And so in the midst of that, though, with the question of lockdown, there is also what we'd call the precautionary principle, which must be applied. So the first and most important principle of human ethics is do no harm. Second most important principle is what we call the precautionary principle. If you're not sure and there's indication that certain actions could cause harm, you should actually choose other actions not to avoid the harm. And in this case, the lockdown is a prudent measure in the short term, because we don't know enough yet about how deadly this thing is. And there's lots more data coming to the fore now, which suggests very hopefully and positively it might not be as deadly as we first thought, which is great. I really hope that pans out.
Yeah.
But you've still got to be careful that in the midst of that precautionary principle, you don't get so cautious that the cure becomes worse than the disease, and you end up causing a depression and you cause suicides, you cause domestic violence to spike, which what happens, we know this, they've already identified this in New Zealand, people trapped at home. You cause suicides from mental health harm to spike, and then you cause a healthcare crisis at the other end of it because you can't afford healthcare that actually ends up taking more lives. So it is a very finely tuned balance. And anyone pretending they've got that anyone, including Ardern, has got the right answer, I'm sorry, it's just we don't know enough yet for anyone to make that claim.
I think the small amount of economic reading that I've done suggests that whenever a government tries to intervene in an economy, things tend to get worse. And certainly if you read Thomas Sowell, his reading of the Great Depression was that it wasn't the stock market crash, it was government intervention that made it 10 times worse than it ever would have been. That everything was trending okay, and it was after government intervention efforts that things started getting really, really bad, and the intervention backfired in a spectacular way.
Yeah, and I think too, there's actually a deeper problem that exists that both sides are failing, I think, to really understand or see. And that both sides tend to want to solve it with either stripping out regulations or too many regulations, if you like. When what really those regulations, they do matter, but what also matters even more importantly is, and this is where I'm so convinced that Burke was on the right track, is that Edmund Burke rightly identified that what you really need is a strong family culture in your society. You need strong virtue. If those things are not present, they cannot substitute. You can't substitute and say we'll control human nature with a law. If human nature is not being tamed by self-regulation through virtue, people will still find ways to be unvirtuous and create loopholes to break those laws, and bad things happen. So it's what you've really got to address is how do we actually restore authentic community to a society so people are not as dependent on these economic factors. You know what I mean? Yeah. They still a factor, and they still matter, but not as catastrophically if you're not isolated and on your own.
There are two traditionally Christian values which are the best insulation for times like this. One is the community of church, and two is the community of family. That when we rely on when we look after our own family members first, our immediate family living under the roof, our extended family living under other roofs, and then our church family, those people around us, then the role of government is greatly diminished, and the burden on government, and hence the rest of the community, is also greatly diminished. And so we have, I have a friend who's Australian, married a Japanese lady, and a missionary in Japan. And I haven't studied this verbatim. I only have his anecdotal witness and testimony to tell me. But there's a welfare system in Japan. But before you can apply for welfare, the government will survey, question, ask, probing financial details of your family. their question and their culture is, why isn't your family looking after you before you come to us for money? Why are you coming to the taxpayers? Doesn't your family have any honor? Don't they have any respect for themselves? And so it's built into their culture that family looks after you first. I love that. I think that's amazing. And if we had more functionality of families in society, look, here's my second point, is that our lifestyle has become far too consumeristic, far too materialistic. And so there's these big eyes that have incredible appetites for what will make us happy, that developing nations simply don't struggle with.
No.
And so this lack of materialism creates more family dependence over there. But over here, our materialism creates a need for two incomes, where a lot of other developing nations don't have that, where you can raise your own children instead of having professional childcare workers and the government. And we see even now that childcare is so expensive. I don't know about New Zealand, but it almost takes 2 or 3 days a week of somebody's second wage just to pay for the childcare, so you can go and earn a second wage.
And it's also too that I think both sides of the political spectrum now have a problem that they might not have recognised. That's the elevation of the autonomous, self-choosing individual to the greatest good in society at the loss of community. And what that does is it leaves us more vulnerable. And ironically, if you're on the right, particularly if you're a libertarian who says, we've got to get rid of big government, guess what happens if you isolate people as individual autonomous units? They need more big government to fill all the void that community and family used to fill in their lives. You're
So
actually
true.
creating the very problem you're trying to solve.
Yeah.
And on the flip side, the other state is like a mother and overcompensate, but it's still got the autonomous, self-choosing individual. My body, my choice. And so what it's done, though, is it makes people autonomous. It separates them in a way that's not healthy. And then on top of that, when you experience economic hardship, or like you say, you add consumerism into that mix, and then you've got a real mess. And so what happens is you get these situations, and sooner or later, we're probably going to have to face up to this fact. The government simply cannot meet the needs of every single individual human being in society. That's why community built on groups of families journeying together is so essential. And by the way, even our model of family needs to be challenged, I think, in a sense that we've embraced the 1950s nuclear family model, which is mum, dad, and their kids. That's not the traditional understanding of family at all. Family, and you go to a lot of Polynesian cultures, you'll see this. Family actually means the whole extended family, aunts, uncles, cousins, they're part of your family. And when you say family, you don't just mean mum and dad almost separated behind their picket fence, but it's everyone's in that together. And that changes the whole dynamic. I was talking to a group of Polynesians just last year as a guest speaker about the issue of euthanasia. And there's several Polynesian ministers there, and they were saying to me, could you explain the difference between the sort of European community in New Zealand and the Polynesian community? Because in our community, when a person gets old, we assign at least one, usually more, family members to journey with them until their death. So they're never on their own. That we don't put them into care. We don't leave them alone. Euthanasia is a concept that doesn't even register.
Yeah, beautiful. Brendan, this is the good news, and there's no ultimate better news than the gospel. Why don't you share with the viewers exactly why you're a follower of Jesus and why you think everyone should be?
Well, for me, it's pretty simple, really. First of all, people often ask me this question: why be Christian? Hasn't science disproved God? Aren't we living in the modern era? Well, look around right now. What's happening? And I would suggest to you that I look at the sociological footprint that Christ left us, and I look at that and I think to myself, you know what? If we actually lived that gospel that he left us to the full, we would be living the best version of society we could. It would still be imperfect in its own way, but we would be living the best version, and it would be a lot better than any other alternative yet. So that's the first thing for me. Secondly, is there's just something so profoundly good and true when you read the Christian scriptures and you read the words of Christ and you see something, you recognize there is authentic truth there. It's like that self-evident truth that it screams at you, of course. Of course, this is what authentic humanity is supposed to be, modeled in the image of God, love for neighbor. And funnily enough, where you see that outworked in a society, the results are profoundly good.
Yep.
Secondly, I look at the data and I look at everything else around the question of what about the problem of evil? Well, Christianity has an answer for that serious problem. It's probably the most convincing argument that atheism can make, but it's not foolproof. And for Christianity, we've grappled with this for hundreds of years. And the answer, of course, is that as difficult as suffering and evil is in the world, God has to allow that in order to allow free will to be safeguarded, because those things come about due to free will, and God, in order to protect that, because if we don't have free will, we can't make a decision to love. If you're not free, you can't love, because to actually love, you've got to freely choose to love. And so I look at that and I say, and then I look, of course, at the reality of the science of the beginnings of human life and everything else, and I see something so profound and wondrous to simply suggest that humanity came into existence from nothing at all, like all the matter in the universe came from nothing with no cause. To me, that takes a lot more faith to believe. So yeah, I'm a human being. There are moments where you struggle and you have doubts and you have sufferings along the journey. But to me, I look to Christ and I see nothing but the fulfillment of the human condition at its fullest. And one of the reasons why Christianity and not any other religion, because you could find comfort in Buddhism if you wanted to, or Hinduism, but Christianity, the difference is the incarnation, when God becomes man. All of a sudden, as Christians, we have a God who says, I'm not just going to go and issue a few commands and say to these people, you must love me and you must follow me. I will go and become one of them. I will walk amongst them. I will suffer like they do, and I will redeem them through that suffering. That is a profound act of love, and that changes the game for Christianity above all other religions for me, put quite simply. And so as we approach Easter, I'm always forced to confront the reality. Well, what happened to the body? If Jesus didn't rise from the grave, where's that body? And why did no one confess to it sooner? So that's why I'm Christian. And I would say, if you're out there and you're listening and you're not sure, especially at a time like this, this is the time to, and here's how you do it. Find yourself a place of quiet and silence. And what I would do is I would suggest to you that you should just stop after this live stream is over and just sit there and say, okay, God, I don't know if you're there, but please, if you're real, show yourself to me. Keep praying that prayer. And guess what? He'll show himself to you. I guarantee your life will be different in 2 weeks if you keep praying that prayer every day. Guarantee it.
Absolutely. Brilliant. Thank you, Brendan. You can catch Brendan on Facebook, facebook.com/MaloneNZ. And you can also catch me on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube, Dave, all of those things /Dave Pellowe. Reach out to either one of us if you'd like more information on how to start your own personal relationship with Jesus Christ, because there's a heck of a lot of bad news. But that's what gives good news its value. Its relative value is that there's an answer for all of those problems and a solution for all of life's questions. And we'd love to walk with that through you and explain and share our confidence and peace for this life as well as the next.
Dave, can I just add one thing too quickly? If I've got my screen up, if you can see that, and a book in relation to what we were talking about before, I'd highly recommend this new book. It's only published in the last 12 months, The Healing Imperative, The Early Church and the Invention of Medicine as We Know It. Very good time to look at that book and the impact of Christianity on shaping medicine as we know it at a time when medicine will be more important than ever before.
Yep, brilliant. Thanks for joining me, Brendan.
No worries. My pleasure, brother. Good to be here.
That's it for this episode of Pellowe Talk, and especially the good news. Make sure you don't keep it to yourself. Share the good news. You can catch me on my website, davepellowe.com, and as I said a moment ago, all of those various channels, YouTube, Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter /Dave Pellowe. And I look forward to sharing those things with you, seeing you in the comments. And as always, this episode has been brought to you by the generous partners and sponsors of Pellowe Talk. And we look forward to seeing you in the comments section. But that's it for now. Have a good day.